Welcome to the Scaleup Valley podcast, where we bring the best founders and investors to help you scale your business from 1 million to 1 trillion. Today's guest is a very special one. We have been trying to do this episode for a long time now. She has a quite unique understanding of different regions in the world, the US, Silicon Valley, LATAM, Southeast Asia, and also an Healthtech experience and specialty. And her name is Jessica Chao, the visiting partner at Iterative and venture partner at SVLC. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Great. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And for the ones who didn't have yet the pleasure to get to meet you as I did, and of course also interact with you and exchange insights about the healthcare industry, that's an industry that we are both passionate about. So who is Jessica?
So all I know is healthcare. So for the most of my life, so for the first like 10 to 15 years of my life, I've been a founder for a consumer health information company, a product designer for a bunch of like telehealth companies. And then my last job was leading clinical innovations at UCSF in San Francisco for the last 7 years. And then last year, I left to do full-time investing because it's just way more fun to work with founders and they work so much faster. So I see all the problems in the hospital, but it just takes a long time to solve them, right? And so I just rather work with companies who are just faster, much more focused and more like well-resourced actually to solve these healthcare problems that I see.
Yeah, and getting out of the bureaucracy to be able to solve these problems outside of the big machines that kind of were built also to mitigate risk, right? And instead of embracing risk, well, what startups are much more about innovation and embracing risks. That's great. And what are the firms that you are at? Maybe a little bit of an introduction of the two firms that you are serving today.
Yeah, so the two main ones that I work with, the first one is called Iterative VC. So they're the YC for Southeast Asia, started 2 years ago with Suken Ui and Brian Ma. And so they go through like batches, basically very similar to the YC format. They're industry agnostic. So I'm the healthcare visiting partner there, where I actually do go through the funnel, do the applications, interview them, and then work with them throughout the batch. So that's Iterative. It's like iterative.vc. You could look at their site. The other one, I'm a venture partner with Silicon Valley LATAM Capital. They're based in the US, actually Presidio. They have an office overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge. And they have an interesting thesis in that they invest both in the US and LATAM. And they basically say that if you solve problems in LATAM, most likely you could solve it for the world, just because the population there is experiencing a lot of like chronic disease. And then also the economy is actually like growing really fast. And so there's a lot of parallels and a lot of people are investing into that space. So for LATAM Capital, we invest in both biotech, medtech, and digital health.
Got it. Sounds amazing. And by the way, just for the ones who are following us, Suken has been on this podcast, so you can go to the podcast on YouTube or on Spotify and just search for Suken, and you will get his episode, a great one. So that's awesome. And it's curious because we have been covering founders also across all these geographies. I would say that in the last course, we had a lot also of LATAM-based founders and American founders as usually European and from Southeast Asia. So it would be nice to also have kind of your view about being able to serve across multiple regions. What are the main trends that you are seeing in Healthtech?
Yeah, I think across regions, so it'll be definitely a generalization.
Right.
And just a caveat that I've been doing it for the last like 2 years. And so these are very new insights that I have seen. And I think what I've seen so far, I think very different than the US. I think these regions, there is like less and less like layers versus like in the US, there's a lot of regulatory layers, right? There's distributors layers, there's pharma layers, whereas consumer are very much like frontline with healthcare. I think that's like one of the major differences that I have seen. And so in that case, it's similar to like, if you go to the open markets, like in Southeast Asia or in LATAM, right? You see like different vendors and like fishes and stuff. What you do immediately is like, okay, there's like 5 vendors. I'm going to go through them to see like which one has the freshest fish and like better pricing. That's actually how they shop for healthcare, right? Very different than the US. And so what do you need? Like, and what you've seen trends and founders do is that you have to know how to sell it to these people, right? Like you have to understand like, hey, subscription may not work as well because you're paying for something with immediate satisfaction instead of future satisfaction, which is something that is difficult to understand. And also like, so people are paying for more, like I'd rather pay for surgery and procedures than like my hypertensive medication, which I don't see a result until like year 50, right? And so you see a lot of those. Yeah, and then I could share more examples, but those that's just like the first ones that came into mind.
Right, and that's kind of also the mindset. There is still a lot of survival mode and short-term oriented, and in other regions, maybe it's much more about mitigating risk and thinking a little bit more long-term prevention. Of course, prevention, there is still a lot to do there, right? So even in the US.
Yeah.
And you see any kind of other general, so you were talking much more about the difference between the US and Southeast Asia and LATAM. Of course, the problems that are being solved in those markets are different from the problems that we are solving in the US. And I think that one of the common mistakes is to try to implement the benchmarking of the US in LATAM or Southeast Asia. And as you said, not understanding the segments, the population, even the GDP per capita, the sensitivity to the pricing. But in general terms, do you see any also, what are you more passionate about in terms of healthcare trends nowadays? What are the startups that are more exciting to you nowadays?
Yeah, I love anything that is more infrastructure based. And so, for example, like these are the ones that are gathering data and able to create like new insights that we've never had before, right? So the ability to look at your genomics paired with your clinical data, which is actually very messy. I actually interact with that on a daily basis before. And then to infer things. And I think to be able to infer things that, for example, like longevity, right? So like survival and stuff, that could be like 10 to 50 years down the road. That is hard, like even for the, like all the researchers out there, right? But it's potentially possible now if you look at the world and different populations, right? If you just look at the US, like you most likely can't do that big of a scale of a research. But if you look at the world, you could look at like what does longevity looks like in other parts of the world, and you get to study that, and you gain a lot more insights all of a sudden, right? So I think from the research data scale, that's definitely something that I think you need a world view, a global view. The other thing is like infrastructure. When I say that, I mean, again, I'm going to go back to like the US versus the Southeast Asia and LATAM, is that US has a lot of deep infrastructure, right? Like we only have a couple distributors now. We only have like a couple EMRs, electronic medical records now that's in the play. But in Southeast Asia and LATAM, it's like greenfield, right? So when you build something, it is like the first time you're able to go from paper to electronic. And not only that, in those like emerging markets, you need to build something that is deeper and much larger because there's no like tentacles. The connections is not there. So you not only need to build the EMR, you need to build like how do I then connect to different lab system, the pathology system, the pharmacy system. That's something that we investors like immediately ask about because it's not useful for the consumer right now if it's not connected, right? Versus in the US, you build like one layer, like I'm the only one that connects the lab to the EMR because everything else is connected. So you could do that one thing really well. versus like elsewhere emerging markets, you have to build all the connections, which is actually very complex, but it's very exciting for me.
Right. So it's kind of solving the fundamental problems before solving the problem that you targeted to solve. So in order to solve the specific problem, you need to solve the infrastructure. That's the way you express it super well. The infrastructure problems that are behind the solution of that problem. Great one. Any other trends that you see that also, for instance, you're seeing also the psychedelics segment or the cannabis segment also popping up with startups, maybe some months or some years ago. I'm not sure how it is today in that space as well, but you see any other trends or startups that are coming your way to analyze for your programs and for your funds?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is, I mean, again, going back, because this is health tech, it's a little bit more infrastructure, but I think we have a lot more like privatized healthcare being more public now, right? So like the behavioral, the mental health for different segmentation. So like the pediatrics, women, men's health, and all of those segmentation you see growing across the globe, right? And then the US, especially just because US are much more open in telling, like I love to tell other people my issues versus like in other emerging markets, it might be more private, right? But even if it's private, it's still important, right? And so I like all of those issues, this is like this underlying thing. What we have seen is not just people coming up with like health tech solutions, but also potentially more like biotech and life science solution, right? So understanding your metabolism, understanding that how does it affect your diet, and then in turn, how does it affect like the stuff you eat, how much you should exercise. So I think that correlation again, deeper into your system and that approach, I feel like that is what I've seen most founders are trying to do more and more.
And I assume that the chronic patient segments keeps being a very important opportunity, and we keep seeing startups and scale-ups trying to enter in the business of trying to condition or model a certain behavior to try to reverse those conditions. It's not an easy play, but how do you see also the evolution of this chronic condition category, because that's kind of 80% of the market, right?
Yeah, I think that's like one of the hardest category where a lot of times I think people come in and like, okay, market is great because there's just tons of people that needs help, right? But the way you solve the problem is so difficult. I think the reason why is behavior. And I led a human-centered design team at UCSF. And so I understand patients and how they think. And different category of patients think so differently. And when they take a pill, like they think about it, it's more like an emotion. It's not just a pill they take, right? And so like this pill makes me sick, or this pill, like I have no idea, it doesn't do anything to me, right? And so this is what like our culture is going to go against, right? Like how are you going to build a startup to make people change the way they do things, right? So people like sometimes do the trends that I see, they usually dangle carrots, right? So like the incentivized ones, the gamification, it worked to a certain extent, but long-term gamification, it usually doesn't work. And there are people that are doing more like the device space, right? So if I can't see, you can see a blood pressure change, sure, but potentially you could see your plaque building up, right? You could see your arteries being clogged, right? Like I think those actually may have a much more immediate effect, right? Again, humans in general are not very good with looking at like future trends. Short-term trends, totally fine, right? People coming in with more programmatic, right? And more, so like I have a 14-week program for this. Or they're being much more focused. I only work with like the 40-some years old who may have previous, who are like energy is just like going down. They could feel the energy going down, right? They can't do what they could done before. And now they have a trigger that they could work with that people would pay into, right? So I see much more of those players coming in than just like in broad stroke. I'm going to help these population.
And it's curious because in other segments of startups and scale-ups, we always talk about don't try to educate the market. So if you need to educate the market, maybe you are the timing is not right. So don't get in the business of educating the markets or changing the behavior of the customer, because it's a very hard one and requires a lot of capital, and even sometimes a lot of capital is not enough to be able to change those behaviors, right?
Yeah, and not only patients, but the family members and the providers also. Those are difficult people to change their minds of.
That's true, because there is also an extra layer of complexity in healthcare. There are so many personas to serve and to have in mind, and how to align all those incentives all in the same direction. And as you said, also being able to take care of the engagement. And in that sense, I like your devices approach, because definitely if we ask people to log in what are their symptoms in a symptom tracker, I think that's we have experienced it ourselves as patients, at least myself as a chronic patient, and I'm not able to log in all my symptoms all the time, so it's almost a difficult job, and I'm sure that somebody is a little bit more disciplined in that sense, but not an easy ask. Cool. And of course, we have different mistakes that are common also to other verticals in the tech world. But what do you see are the main mistakes in Healthtech? Kind of those that we are seeing again and again and again. And when you are receiving the decks, you are saying, okay, this will not be easy, or this is an extreme red flag, or how can I help the founder to tell him or her in a good way, in a constructive way, that maybe this might not work?
Yeah. This is a little bit contradicting what I just said before about building the tentacles. A lot of founders build a lot of features, and that I think that's just across all startups and all sector industries, especially in healthcare. It's like a rabbit hole. If you ask to provide what they need, they will tell you a million things. And the goal is that you don't build a million things, and not a million things will work, right? And so I think what I've seen is that people like talking to patients and like talking to providers, but they don't know how to then digest that like information and provide like, hey, this is actually what they want. And so build something that people want, not just what they tell you, is a big mistake in healthcare, especially because when a surgeon tells you that you need something, right? Sometimes a lot of times they're like, oh, they actually need something. But actually, if you look at the workflow, they can't even fit it into the workflow, right? They just want the data, right? And so I think there's a lot of those mistakes about like talking to the users versus like knowing what they want. And especially a mistake in healthcare, there is more of a gap. And so what I usually tell founders is actually build something really fast and then test it in the market, see what the reaction is, right? If you could see it, then you could actually confirm or contradict what your feedback that you have gotten, right?
Yeah. This is a good point. And sometimes founders have a hard time understanding what are kind of those models that they can use to validate certain assumptions. Do you have any examples about kind of a waiting list on the website? So is there any examples that you have seen that work well and that really give us a data point that is valid? Because sometimes, of course, we can do research and have a lot of interviews, but and listen or pay attention to what is the dream that we want to build, and not what is really being said, right?
Yeah,
because as founders we are very optimistic, right, about the future, and that's why we go to such a bet of starting up a company.
Yeah. So there are a lot where in Healthtech especially, we call it like what do you call it, like a ghost EMR, where they build like a really complex system and a platform that providers will have to basically like click out of their normal system to use the secondary system and then go back in, right? So whether that could be a documentation optimization software where they were like, oh yeah, it's like a provider would just copy this and then paste it there. And then they would basically like, we'll edit it and then we'll like copy it back So even though for them it's like 2 seconds, none of the providers will do it, right? But all of the providers told them they want something like that. Until you show them this is the workflow and this is what you need to do, and you watch a provider do it, then you'll know like, oh yeah, no one's going to actually do that. So that's very clear. There are other ones that are more surprising. I think the scribes work. So I think especially in the US, we utilize a lot of scribes, medical scribes that actually like listen to the providers and be able to like write up the note, right? So in that case, there is a there is a like previous version where it's like a human being there. And so I think when you layer the AI on, it actually works really well. Providers actually appreciate it when there's this like ambient sensing and ambient listening going on,
Right.
and be able then to scribe it into the EMR, right? So like that is the solution that providers will want, right? So subtle difference, but I think in the application world and the actual like operations world, it makes a world of difference.
Yeah, and this is kind of amazing. So the providers can focus themselves on really adding value to the patient and understanding the patient instead of going through the bureaucratic tasks. And they can kind of delegate that to the AI technology to fill in the spaces by themselves. So super exciting. I think that we are almost there, right? So we have I know some startups that are we are
a
already
lot
there.
of startups.
So it's
I
more
think,
the implementation or adoption.
Yeah, for sure. I think there is a gap still between like, I think for things that are very much easy to do and easy to understand. So like the urgent care, the orthopedics, those are much like surgical, like post-surgery like visit, those are easier to understand for AI and scribes. But you see like differences in documentation when you get to like primary care or psych, where there's a lot of conversation going on. And the providers usually digest a lot in their brain in order to like spit out whatever information is useful. That is still a little bit more difficult, right? And so it's more like if you go into healthcare and know which segmentation you could win, don't go to all those spaces because not all segmentation within healthcare will work for your company.
Right. And would you give the same advice for more mature markets as the US and Europe that you would give to Southeast Asia and LATAM in terms of that focus? Or do you feel that focus is something really important across any region, any market, or do you see that in developing markets we need to be a little bit more careful with that focus, given the reasons that you commented before?
Yeah, I think for all of those markets, focus is important. But focusing on what would be slightly different. So for example, like in the US, I mean, because you could laser focus on something and it could become $1 billion company. In Southeast Asia, that one thing will most likely not equate to that dollars.
Got it.
However, your focus should be understanding what's the easiest thing that I could build that could actually get me to that equivalent of evaluation, right? So that's a focus you need. And that's different. So it could be building more like the health stack, but very focused on that one stack and one segmentation. So I think like a lot of the procedural, like surgical things, because there is an innate like revenue generating business in there, it's much easier to build platforms that could also be revenue generating. So those are easier play with Southeast Asia and LATAM versus the primary care.
Got it. Super interesting. And do you see any traits, or if you think about the teams that you have been working with, that you have worked with in the past, is there any traits or any patterns that you see that, of course, this is at a kind of a very open question that people like to ask, and of course there is not a formula, but anyway, we see patterns in founders that we like to work with and usually tend to do well. I know that unfortunately there are also amazing founders out there that were not able to build amazing companies, and they are great anyway, so I don't like to do the good and the bad, right? So kind of sense, but do you see any patterns on the ones who are succeeding?
Yeah, I think especially in healthcare, I think those two could learn fast, and like it clicks for the founder. So I think in healthcare, the more you learn, it doesn't necessarily mean you actually understand better. There's a point where the more you learn, like when you talk to the 100th patient, what you get for someone who actually really understands patients is very different than someone who don't understand patients, right? And I think you see that click within founders. They're like, okay, I kind of understand what this population actually is, right? So like the chronic diseases, like think about it as like, I think about it as like emotion across. So it's more like these are mundane diseases. People have to do it every day, right? Like think about that, right? Sometimes it takes like many more patients for this founder to really understand the population. But the people that are mostly successful are those who could learn fast, and it clicks for them. I think the second trait is just being humble, just because healthcare is so deep that you need like basically PhDs from all different sectors. Like I need someone who could be a good CTO, a good clinician, a good CEO, a good ops person, and they're each very distinct, but very important. And especially in healthcare, it's extremely humbling that a clinician like an MD, PhD don't know how to build a product. It's just like across the board, like that's just normal, right? And it's okay. And if you're able to find a team that works well with each other and works well with the differences, that's when you know that you found a good team.
Yeah. And being able as a founder to lead with egos and different cultures, different backgrounds, I think that that's one of the most challenging in healthcare, and one of the most, I would say, inspiring at the same time, to be able to bridge that gap. And for the ones who like psychology, it's really amazing, kind of build a high performing team and coming and bringing everyone together around the mission and the vision, and that's why. And of course, being able to adapt the message to each different stakeholder, because if we get too technical in the VC world, the clinical side of the team will turn off, and vice versa. If the clinical team also becomes too technical about what they are talking about, the business guys will be driven crazy.
Yeah, and I think there's usually more metrics that I look at for healthcare companies. I think for SaaS or like medtech or health tech, you look at basically all the growth numbers like all other companies, but you also look at whether they're actually making a difference. So are they actually clinically like sound, right? Are actual patients getting better? They're not just using your product. Are they actually getting better? Are they feeling better? Or what is your clinical endpoint that you have that you want? And so I think that a lot of times is missing, just because I think VC are so into like all the numbers and growth trends, but they don't really get to like, are you actually solving a healthcare problem?
We talk a lot about metrics in different stages. Do you see any difference from health tech startups to other startups? So it's kind of, again, being able to acquire and retain customers and prove that product market fit in a first stage, let's say from 0 to 1, and then from 1 to 10, it's all about building that revenue machine, that repeatability, that predictability that will allow us to scale the business. And in this sense means being able to have a higher impact to millions of lives, and making people feel better, and be happy, or at least having the option of being happy without being messed up with their health.
Yeah, I think healthcare is hard when you are building for like the 0 to 10 users, because usually you don't get enough of a representative sample. And so usually it's similar to like how they do statistics for designing clinical trials. You need a representative sample, right? So for example, if you're building something for like, let's see, like an MS population, multiple sclerosis, right? These are generally younger population, but you need like a diverse number to understand the mobility needs for this population, right? Different disease progression, right? Those that might be in a recession versus like those that have like active disease and such. And so you just need to be able to understand the lifetime of this disease in order to build something that you want, right? And so usually the 0 to 10 is much harder. the 10 to 100 sometimes is easier. So 10 to 100, I mean like the average numbers for this population. Sometimes it's easier because you get to see like more of a trend. Then if you go the scaling phase, sometimes what you see is that there is the adoption varies for a lot of patients. So it's not like a pill that you'll be like, okay, everyone is a hypertension pill. You see like, okay, so only this population wants my product during this phase of their disease states, right?
Right.
And so all of a sudden, like when you scale, you just need to be able to hit them at the right trigger in order to really understand and how to sell to this population. And so sometimes like paid marketing and all of those like normal things that you would to scale may not work as you scale for healthcare. You might need more targeted. So like working with a surgery clinic, working with a hospital in order to target those populations so you could get to them. Because usually at that point, like paid marketing don't necessarily work better than like referrals or other types of marketing.
Interesting components to be aware of. And I think that we missed it. So that you explained a little bit more about the thesis for the ones who are listening and would like to reach out to you. So kind of what you have, I think that you have explained it super well, the thesis of Iterative, kind of the Y Combinator for Southeast Asia. Not sure if you want to elaborate even more, just for to make it to be aware that the ones who are listening us know kind of what are your theses for both funds that you serve.
What do you mean by teasers?
Sorry, thesis. That's my pronunciation.
Oh, sorry.
Investment
thesis. Oh, your thesis?
Yes.
oh, got it. Like thesis for both, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So thesis for Iterative, it's really simple. We want founders who are solving a problem that is basically impacting the world, right? And so for Iterative, it's that if you're founders who are passionate about solving a problem that you have started thinking about it, you could apply for the accelerator. And then just go to iterative.vc and take a look. We'll have rolling applications. We're very friendly to founders. If it's not ready yet, we'll tell you, and we'll tell you good feedback, right? We're building a community. It's mostly about community, helping each other. And so that's Iterative. SVLC, it's more of a C to A VC. So we work as a traditional VC in that we love any founders who is solving a problem that solves for LATAM or in the US, or if you're building a company that may be interested in working and expand it into either region, we would love to talk to you. We're actually industry agnostic. And so we funded a lot of fintech, a lot of alternative protein, and this healthcare as well. And so any founders who are like in that space, definitely feel free to reach out to me.
And when you say from C to A, not from the pre-seed stage, is excluded typically on your investments in that thesis?
I think we love talking to founders and build relationships. So even like if you're as early on, like, hey, I don't know if this business model could work, like talk to us, right? And we usually like build relationship with founders early on too.
And that's great always to have feedback and start relationships as soon as possible, because this is a marathon and not a sprint, right? So it's always good to start early to build those relationships that will help also to already understand if we are a mutual fit and if we are able to work well together to keep executing the mission and the vision. So, and this is the moment that we come to the last segment of the show where I ask you a quick question and you give me a short answer or reflection. So let's start with the reflection part. If you would have the opportunity to have a coffee with your younger Jess, let's say at the beginning of your journey as an investor, to be easier, what advice would you offer to your younger self?
I'm not very good at failing, and it's because I haven't failed a lot in life, and that's something that I wish I've done more and taking more risk. And so definitely I would tell my younger self, like, it's okay to take way more risks so that you could fail. I think training to understand how to fail and get back up is something that I learned older, but I wish I had learned it like way younger. And so that's definitely something I would tell my younger self.
Love it. And what are you the most proud of on your journey so far?
Uh, this could be silly. And so I picked up product design basically in my 20s, just so I could work with a tech team to build companies. At some point, I was earning like $200 an hour. And I was like, oh my gosh, I made it as a product designer. Definitely not as good now. But that was a point where I was like, oh yeah, like anyone could pick up anything and be good at it. I think that's like what I've learned during that phase of my life.
Love it. Worst advice ever received?
Oh, someone told me to settle down and get a job. And I think I'm settled down already. Like, this is what I like to do. Even though it feels like it's always in transition. I think I've just learned that this is just my life now, right? You're just always in transition. Like, this is the job right now, but it could be completely different the next day, and that's okay. Yeah.
That's great. It's a very important muscle for our current times, right? To be flexible, yeah, and to adapt ourselves and to be always in transitioning, as you said. And now let's go into the resources. Your favorite book. It can be business or non-business. You decide. This is more about getting to know each other.
This is one of the books that I love. It's called Irrationality in Healthcare by Professor Doug Hoff from Hopkins. So he gave me the book when I graduated there. It's really about how healthcare just contradicts each other all the time. How providers confusing patients confuse themselves. The economist is very confused about how to price things. It's just irrational. And it paints a really good picture of how you would want to think about healthcare. So that's the first book that got me thinking about, like, hey, this healthcare is actually really complex, and it's really exciting to me.
Love it. Favorite movie or series, as you wish?
Oh, okay. This one I love talking about. So I'm a Trekkie. I love Star Trek Voyager with Captain Janeway. I think it's just the leadership approach with Star Trek and the teamwork is just amazing. The other thing about series in general is that they just paint a world where the world just works together to fix all the problems, right? So there's no more corruption, no more famine, there's no more hunger. And the team just works to find new frontiers, right? And I just hope that one day, like, we could be a humanity that's sort of like that we work together to solve the world's problem.
Love it. Super inspiring. And finally, the favorite podcast, excluding this one, if you are a fan of podcasts. If
not. I am not a fan of podcasts because it's just hard for me to sit down and listen to some things. Yeah. I'm always doing things, but I love TikTok. And so I think TikTok, the snippets, I think like the 20 VC I've been listening, just like quick snapshots of things that's happening in the world. That's easy for me to digest. And I love it.
Super interesting. TikTok is really, it's not only taking off. I think it's really exploding in a certain way.
I usually get like puppies and stuff before I sleep, and now like I switched to more educational, and now they're just like layering more and more educational things. So like I'm learning from day to night now, just with TikTok.
Incredible. Any final message that you would like to share with founders before we go? Any final words, reflection, as you wish? Anything that I should have asked about that I didn't ask during our conversation?
No, I think just saying, like, I'm still learning, right? Like, this is basically like my second year full time doing this investment thing, right? So I think it would be interesting to like talk about this again in 5 years and see what I would say, right? And I think for all the founders out there, it's more like keep learning and keep challenging each other. Feel free to contact me anytime, and happy to have conversations with you. Awesome.
Jess, it was really a pleasure to have you on the show. Congrats for your track record and for the approachability, and always willing to help founders that I've experienced it myself. So, and you are always welcome to come back to reflect about the future of healthcare.
Great, sounds good. Well, take care.
And to our community, thanks for being on that side. We keep bringing you the best of the best to make your life easier, going from 0 to 1, 1 to 10, and 10 to 100. See you soon, and keep scaling.